everyone, thanks for tuning in to this special episode of Zerodha Educate. In the past few months, there has been an insane amount of volatility in the markets. And surprisingly, this has led to a lot of new investors entering the markets. But they continue to make the same old mistakes when putting their hard-earned money to work. We've been speaking to some of the most experienced people in the market and realized that this is the right time to talk to someone who can give investors a blueprint on how to make their first investment. So, in the next 2 episodes, we're going to learn from the absolute basics on how to start investing and building this up. Hi, I'm Prateek Singh. I'm the CEO of LearnApp. And if you want to learn anything to do with trading or investing from the brightest minds in the world, check out learnapp.com. In this episode, we have a special guest with us. We have Vidya Bala, the founding partner and head of research of product at Prime Investor. Vidya is a chartered accountant by qualification and has a rich experience of 18 long, glorious years, 15 of which were spent actually analyzing the market. So Vidya began her career as a senior internal auditor for Ashok Leyland. She then went right asset allocation, pick equity and debt funds, and how to rebalance and maintain your portfolio. So please enjoy my awesome... Hi everyone, I'm Prateek Singh and today I have Vidya with me from Prime Investor. Hi Vidya, thanks for doing this.
Hi Prateek.
Can you give me a quick intro of what Vidya does and how long you've been in the market?
Yes, I have been in the stock market for close to say 16 years now. I'm basically a chartered accountant and a postgraduate in economics, a very different line. When I started out, I was essentially an internal auditor for a big automobile manufacturing company, and 2.5, 3 years of stint there. And that's when I thought, and I had started investing by then. And I thought, equity and research interested me. And I moved on to a different kind of role, which gave me exposure to not just pure equity research. So I was with the Hindu Business Line newspaper in the research bureau. Right. Essentially only doing analysis, not part of the reporting, but then you got to meet all the bigwigs, the CXOs, and you also got to do a lot of company visits. So that gave tremendous exposure that you might not have otherwise got into not just analyzing stocks, but looking at companies and understanding what they do. So that was my, second stint. And the third and the most important one was, Funds India, where I, joined as a head of research. I was there for about 7.5 years. And that was a time when digital investing, digital platforms were just taking off. So, so that was a great, very steep learning curve in terms of doing things digitally, doing things in a scalable manner, ensuring that research and quality advisory is, given in a democratized way, covering large number of people and at the same time ensuring that your quality does not suffer. So those challenges, how to do that in a efficient way, in a automated way, are things that you learned apart from just the equity and or debt analysis. So and then now the fourth is my own venture with a couple of my partners who are also working with me earlier at Funds India. Yeah. And this comes from this time, it comes not just from a need to change your career, but a real need to make a difference to what we understood as the problems of a retail investor. Right. So this part essentially came from our understanding of investors over several years now. Their need not just to transact, where very good platforms have come up now, but they need to get good advisory, unbiased advisory, quality inputs and alerts on when they should act and when they should not. So, and how to go about doing this, again, in a scalable manner to a large number of investors, because that kind of input is available today, but for select investors, HNIs, who have specific, wealth managers and, people to cater to them. We want to democratize that too. And that's where Prime Investor comes in, and hopefully we'll be able to do that.
Of course you will. You're Vidya. So now the interesting thing is that for a living, you're actually going through stocks, going through funds, understanding whether the funds are good or not. And that's what's going to make this podcast, this episode super interesting, right? A lot of people out there want to know whether the funds they own are either meeting their goals or not, or are actually good or not. So hopefully this podcast should help.
Yep.
So one of the first things that we learn when we want to start investing, and this happened sometime back with someone came up to me and he said, hey, I've started to invest. I'm like, that's amazing. Why did you begin to invest? And he said, to make money. So I said, that may be the wrong place to begin. Perhaps the first place to think is to actually set a goal, right? A short-term or a long-term goal. So is this the right way of thinking about investing, Vidya?
Yes, Pratik. I mean, you got the meat of the, investing journey, right? So most people want to save, want to invest or make a lot of money. Or if you prod more, they'll probably say, I need 1 crore, right?
Yeah.
Because after Kaun Banega Crorepati, everybody likes a crore as a number to reach. So, those are the typical answers. But the problem is, it doesn't solve your real financial problems when you don't have a goal. Right. So why do you really need a goal to be investing? There are several reasons. First and foremost is that your goal not just gives you a number towards which you aspire. But once you say, I need 30 lakhs, 40 lakhs or 50 lakhs, say for my own education, or, if you're going to fund your child's education and so on, then you have a direction to what you're investing towards. So the figure matters first. The second and more important thing is that when you set a goal, then you know what kind of instruments that you can invest in, what sort of channels that you can use to invest in to reach that goal. For example, sitting with your 4% savings bank account and saving a lot of money is probably not going to take you to, a goal, because it's not going to earn you the right kind of returns. Yeah. At the same time, if you need, say, money 1 year down the line to kind of, pay for, the fee for your child's school education, you probably can't be punting it, and you probably can't be taking risks and losing even that, because it's a crucial goal. So therefore, understanding, one, the amount that you need, and two, the time frame of your goal helps give direction to your goal in terms of the amount you will save, and also the nature of instruments that, you will have. So that's essentially why you need a goal, and goal also helps you kind of define what you will do when, right? So you have your retirement, and you have your child's education, or you have your own, holiday and so on. So you're clearly demarking. So there's something called mental accounting, in behavioral finance, where at least in your mind, you're able to push, kind of segregate your money into, purpose is this. In those days, if you remember, some of our parents or grandparents used to have a jar sometimes and put money for the vegetables or milk in one, and, something else in the other, and just keep it segregated. Yeah. So that's essentially what they were doing. So they were able to split the money in hand into things that they needed to spend. The same thing when applied to investing works very well for you in terms of giving you a direction. So pretty much that's that. The more important thing is that it helps define your risk, and therefore you know what sort of instruments you can go to and where you should stay away.
Absolutely. Actually, even if you look at read any of the self-help books, etc., where you want to achieve something, you need to have a measurable objective and how to get there, right? So I guess this answers that also, the behavior part of if you want money, what do you really want to do with it? So step one, like Vidya said, set a goal and then figure out how much money you need and work backwards. Now, there are 2-3 ways of doing this, right, Vidya? Most of us aren't stock geniuses and are likely not to become. So picking the next best stock is one way. The other way is going through a mutual fund. So why does it make more sense to do a mutual fund versus the average investor to just select some stocks he thinks will grow?
Right. So there are multiple things. Let me start with the goal itself. Let's suppose, you wanted, say, 30 lakhs 10 years down the line for, say, the undergrad education of your child. And, if you just make an assumption that you're going to earn 10% annualized, you might say, I need 11.5 lakh to invest today to reach the 30 lakhs 10 years down the line, right? Now, this 11.5 lakhs per se, first of all, looks daunting, right? Yeah. And then you realize this 11.5 lakhs has to be invested. Perhaps, if you like stocks, maybe in 3 stocks, 4 stocks. First, you don't know whether you have 11.5 lakhs in hand today to buy those stocks. And 2, you don't know at what points you should be buying them, how to spread your money over several periods or average those stocks such that you actually, make the best of any market falls. Now, those challenges is what makes stock investing difficult, even assuming you are able to identify, 3 or 4 good stocks. The 3 or 4 good stocks, even the best of stocks, need some amount of timing. And that's what makes stock investing a lot more difficult. It's not just about analyzing the, stocks and getting into them, but to know when to get into them, and you should also know when to fold it up, right? So that's equally important. Yeah. That's what basically a fund manager does for you through mutual funds, right? And he's not going to restrict it to 3-4 stocks. So you, for this 11.5 lakhs, let's split it further into an SIP. Assuming the same 10% return, I'll probably need 15,000 a month. Now, 15,000 a month seems a lot more easier for me. Yeah. But with this 15,000 a month, I possibly can't be buying 10 stocks or 20 stocks, right? But the fund manager is going to do this for you. So what he is essentially doing is diversifying your portfolio, diversifying your risks, hoping that even if 2 of the stocks that he picked didn't work, maybe 8 will work for you. So that's the whole idea of going the mutual fund way, where you can have, one, you can save small sums towards the goals, because a large sum will always look daunting, and naturally you may not even have the savings to do that. And stocks do need some amount of deep pockets. You can say I will do averaging in stocks, but that's not easy at all, right? As we all know, knowing when to find the lows is not an easy thing. So with stocks, it naturally happens because some expert is doing this for you, and because you have a wider portfolio, there will always be opportunities where a fund manager would keep averaging. So, and therefore you end up, one, having a small sum that you can invest regularly, so your goal no longer looks daunting. 2, you don't have to be an expert in picking stocks. And 3, you can hold a very diversified basket, thus reducing your risks. So I would say these are some, not all of the, very key reasons why a mutual fund route can be very appealing to a retail investor.
Right. Now, Vidya, we both know what the listener is thinking right now. He's thinking, okay, great. I'm convinced I'll figure out a way to invest through mutual funds, but how much money can I really make? Is 15%, say, guaranteed every year? How should I look at this?
Right. So that's where, one of the key things when you enter mutual funds is you understand what to expect from them. Yeah. If you don't, you're lost. I'll just take the same example. Somebody has a goal, like I said, of 30 lakhs for child's education, very earnest about saving. You could say, you need a SIP of say 15,000 if I'm going to earn 10% return. But that 15,000 SIP might seem very high. So this person decides, look, I'm coming into mutual funds to earn more. So I'm going to have an expectation of 20% at least. Yeah. And therefore I need a SIP only of 8,000. So an 8,000 rupees SIP, you're going to run for 10 years, hoping that it's going to deliver 20% to reach your goal. Now, this is completely insane. I mean, So you don't do that in mutual funds. Obviously, you come into mutual funds because you think you can get a lot more than you would with your savings bank or your FD, but you should know how much. That's important, and in what market conditions, in what time frames. Right? It's very hard for a retail investor to figure that, but there are simple ways to do it. The simplest way for you to do that would be setting your return expectation just about 2 percentage points over FD. Why am I saying this? That's, basically your FD today, the bank or the RBI ensures that you are getting a return that is at least 1.5 to 2 percentage points more than inflation. That's the idea, at least, right? So FD is partly covering inflation. Next, you are taking some risk through coming into equity and you want it to deliver. So let's not get into the mathematics of doing, where you could look at a capital asset pricing model and look at, how much should be your, rate. But just take 2 percentage points more than your FD for the risk that you have taken, and keep that as your expectation and work your goal. Okay, so anything that you get over and above this is a big bonus. But if you keep your expectation as 20% and your returns that was delivered is 10%, you are really way behind your goal. You will realize it only at the 8th year or 9th year, believing, checking your portfolio and realizing that, my portfolio delivered 8-9%, but I had expected 20%. And so here I am with a yawning gap. So to avoid that, it's best to keep your expectations low. I'm not saying that you need to keep it as low as FD or your savings. You can also, if you're a little more discerning, you can also look at how the economy is growing, right? In the past, say 3 years and 5 years, If your economy has been growing, the real growth has been 6%, and your inflation has been 4-5%. 11% is the bare minimum that, should be an expectation over the next 5-10 years. Whereas if you are in a more mature economy and your economy is say growing at 4%, right? And your inflation in a mature economy, likely that inflation will also be low. So your inflation is say 3%. So 7% is actually the nominal growth of GDP in the country. So you probably can expect, a little more 8% or 9% growth in your equities. So essentially your equity can't grow way larger than the rate at which your country is growing. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. So equity, yes, individual stocks will, because stocks, can get re-rated because they have either done phenomenally well or they have a big, kind of moat that other competitors can't reach and so on. But that's a different story. When you have a portfolio, when you are having a basket of stocks, returns tend to get normalized, right? Some perform, some don't perform. So your returns by and large, should be a reflection of how the economy is. That's the simplest way of looking at it. So keep your return expectations very close to your GDP, or simply keep a 2 percentage point plus on your FD and work towards it as far as equity is concerned.
Vidya, one follow-up question, maybe with just one line, we'll get some clarity. You talked about expectation to be slightly better than what the country's growth is using GDP. And then you also said something about how it can be slightly better than FD, 2 percentage points. Can you also look at, say, the index average over the last X number of years and say, okay, maybe I might be able to do somewhere there near the benchmark? Is that a fair thing?
We used to until 2008-9. Looking at the index, a lot of things change once in a decade, right? We are probably in for such a transition even this decade. But what happens is that the return expectations stems from the earnings growth. It stems from the return on equity that these stocks have delivered. Now, India clearly has undergone a change in the past decade in terms of both of these, both in terms of the ability of companies to deliver on earnings and the ability of companies to deliver on return on equity for their stakeholders. And both of these go down. Sometimes both your stock returns and your valuations, even if you take something like we are above the average PE of the last 10 years or we are below the average, they'll only give you so much, right? They will only kind of give you an indicator based on the growth that was prevailing then. But what if you're in for an entirely different kind of phase now? And what if a very select set of stocks, which has been the case in the last 2 years, perform and the others don't, right? Yeah. So only those funds or those portfolios that are able to pick those end up with that kind of returns that the index delivers. The others may actually be underperforming. So it becomes very difficult to predict. So as a retail investor, the best is stick to your own goal, stick to your own return expectations. And what's the antidote if you're not able to, if you see that you're far below your return expectations, the antidote is more savings. There is absolutely no other way. So it also has a technical word called value averaging.
Yeah.
Sometimes you think value averaging is only about buying on dips. It really is not. Value averaging can be when your portfolio is significantly lower than your expectation. So you put in more money, that is also value averaging. It essentially means you save more. But that's a separate topic by itself about value averaging. But fact remains that stick to your goal. Stay focused towards your goal, stay focused towards what your return expectations were, and fine tune it as you go. Supposing you have a 20-30-year-old goal and the country's GDP is not going to remain what it is, right? So you need to fine tune that too. So as long as you stay with those, the need to work back, look at lot of data, etc., which is avoidable because as a mutual fund investor, you don't want to be doing all that. And then, on top of it, paying a fund manager to do this job.
Right. Makes sense. So we're going to dive a little deeper into this. So now we'll go into asset allocation. After that section, we'll go into picking funds, and then we'll go a little bit into portfolio maintenance. So this is for the listeners to know what flow we'll be taking. So let's start with asset allocation. It's probably the least understood. And to be honest, it sounds very fancy, right? I'm going to asset allocate. And what it basically means is you have a bunch of assets, say gold, say equity and debt, and you're choosing to mix them up according to your age or your goals, etc. But a lot of people, Vidya, say that asset allocation is very, very important. So in simplest terms, what is it and why does it matter?
Okay. So I think this illustration that I'm giving might have been quoted, but let's take Bangalore as an example for the weather. Bangalore's weather, I have been in Bangalore for a few years, and the weather used to be unpredictable, nice and sunny, and then suddenly it gets cloudy and then it pours cats and dogs. A street vendor in Bangalore, is selling umbrellas and sunglasses, right? It's strange because he knows at each point only either of these can get sold. Nobody's going to buy sunglasses when it's cloudy and it's going to rain, and nobody's going to buy an umbrella when it's bright and sunny, right? So he sells sunglasses, he sells umbrellas. What is he doing? He's just diversifying his risk because he can't predict the weather in Bangalore. So he's going to sell both. One of these have to sell at some point, at each point. If it's sunny, somebody is going to buy the sunglasses and somebody is going to buy the umbrella if it suddenly starts raining, right? So that's actually, asset allocation. He's doing that for his own business because he's trying to protect his business. The same when done to your wealth is asset allocation. So you do not know whether the asset that you invest in is going to perform well over the next 5 years, 10 years, 2 years. And therefore you want to counter it with another asset that is not so correlated, which may perform better when this is not performing. Gold being a very classic case. We have seen the kind of returns that gold has delivered in the last 4-5 months. So it's a very classic example. When you see risk in equities, when you see risk equity underperforming, you have gold. And then there are bonds, right? So bonds also tend to act as a hedge when your equity is not performing. And even without that, when your equity is very volatile, bonds tend to give you some kind of a cushion. So this essentially is because you do not know which asset is going to perform when you are spreading, you're just not going to put all the eggs in one basket. That's all that asset allocation is about. When you do asset allocation, what is important is to have assets that have a reasonable amount of, which can supplement each other, which are not highly correlated, right? So if you're going to take highly correlated assets, then you're going to perform very similarly. Let's forget even asset allocation. Let's take countries, for instance. Some of the emerging countries, supposing you want to hold some stocks in some of the emerging nations or some mutual fund of emerging market and want to hold India too. India is highly correlated with other emerging markets. So holding those mutual funds and your own, country's mutual fund may not really help give you the asset allocation. It may not help you diversify your risk. So when you identify assets, and therefore the experts have done it for us broadly, gold, bonds and stocks by themselves can offer diversification of your risk, can perform differently at different points. Rare occasions, they all go down on rare occasions. And that's why you have cash. So cash by itself can be an asset allocation. So that's a fourth asset allocation of liquidity. So that's what you need to do with asset allocation to ensure you improve your chances of your portfolio delivering reasonably well at all times, of your portfolio delivering consistently, of your portfolio not suffering from any deep shocks.
Right. So I think a lot of investors, especially people who are listening to this, also understand their different assets. But let me paint a story, right? And then you can probably respond to that. So here's what happens. Pre-corona or pre-2008, everyone is sitting saying, look at the returns of equity. This is the CAGR. Look how amazing it is. And they'll write this beautiful story and probably connect it to some macro event saying India is growing, blah, 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 etc. And they'll say, okay, I think I should do most of my allocation to equity because it has performed well. And then we know what happens, like a 2008 happens or something else happens in an extreme case. And then you're on the other side where you're at 2009, say, and you say, oh, equities performed terribly bad, but why don't we look at bonds? Bonds were doing so well, it's safer, it's better. And then they'll probably allocate bonds or cash or something else. Now, I feel what people are doing with their, and I could be wrong, is that they're looking at returns first and then saying, okay, this is how I'm going to allocate it. So how do I figure out the right asset allocation for myself?
Right. So good question, Pratik. So most people want to do a kind of a complete score, doing risk analysis, risk tolerance, and but which is good, which is a good thing, and many platforms would give you those ready-made scores. But at the end of the day, it basically boils down to two things. One is your time frame. How long can you? I mean, how long do you want this money to grow before you need it? The second is, are you perfectly okay if you lose this money tomorrow and you can just carry on with life, right? These are very, very simple questions, but those are the only things that will give you the answer. Because when you ask somebody, are you an aggressive investor? The thought in their mind is, yes, I'm aggressive from a point of view of having a high return expectation, but not from a point of view of high risk tolerance in terms of losing money.
Aggressive, but I don't want any losses.
Exactly. So how do you then, figure it? It simply boils down to your time frame, because there you don't have to assess, you don't have to judge your risk. You can simply look at, this is the simplest way. I mean, I'm not saying the most optimal way, but it's the simplest way. Look at your time frame. You simply, if you need a money down the year or 2 years down the year, equity is a volatile asset class. Equity can not deliver even up to 5 years, sometimes generating losses even over 5 years. These are data points. So past data tells us that there is a probability. So then how do you go about doing it? So if 1 year, 2 year, your risk is very high in equities, then you have to have more in debt, essentially, or a little bit in gold. Right? Gold also is a volatile asset class, by the way. Debt is a least volatile asset class. So you end up having more in debt. Then as your years, for example, just take 5 or 7 years, 5 years as a cutoff. 5 years is a point in time where your probability of getting negative returns in equity comes to just 2-3%. It's not zero, but it comes to 2-3%. Right?
Very low.
So that's, it's very low, but it's not zero. At around 7 years, you're almost at zero. So that's where you stand. So it's, if you want to do a very mathematical way, it would be about putting those combinations to see how your portfolio will still generate your 7-8% or whatever, even if equity falls, which is a very hard thing, right? Over 5-year time frames. And therefore you try and bring in some amount of debt, some amount of gold to cushion it. Now, as the years go, like 7 years, 10 years, your ability to take the risk is slightly higher, simply because you know for sure that equity will somehow deliver. At least all the 25-30 year data points to the fact that they just can't fail. If the economy has grown by 7-8%, your equity should have delivered by that. I mean, I'm talking in nominal terms, not the real GDP. So you don't need very strict thumb rules, your age minus and all of those. Simply just need to get an idea of, at 50% equity, for example, again, these are backed by numbers. You are reasonably safe for a 5-year time frame. Your possibility of ending with losses is almost nil if you have 50% equity. Now 60% equity, yes, still, because I said the possibility of getting a negative return is only 2-3% over 5 years. So you could still afford to have, a 60% equity and not get negative return. So this is how you kind of set yourself thumb rules. So you can go up to, 70%, 80%. So if I'm having a 20-30 year old gold, does it mean I can have 100% equity? Not really, because you will still come across many phases where your equity will fall. And if that fall is really hard, it takes time for your asset to again come back, for your wealth to again climb back. So that time, the opportunity loss is what makes it very painful. And that's when your wealth grows suboptimally. So to ensure that your wealth is still growing, even when equity is not doing well, some amount of debt or some amount of gold becomes necessary. So that's why, the maximum we say, you can go up to 80%. For just to give you an example, between 2005 and 10, the worst market fall that we would have had, just giving 10% allocation to gold and 20% allocation to, say, debt would have ensured in these 5-year period, supposing your goal was exactly over those 5 years between 2005 and 10. 2005 was a great market. 2006-7 was further, amazing markets. Yeah. So if you had entered then and you had, steadily done this asset allocation and made sure that you were rebalancing and all of that, you'll be at least 15% more in your wealth than without any of these, right? If you, of course, had taken 100% equity, you would have been much, much lower. Your wealth would have been much lower, say by 30-40% compared with this. But good asset allocation combined with rebalancing, which we'll talk about later, is what helps you ensure that the shocks are cushioned and therefore the climb back is not too hard. So that's about it. I mean, with shorter time frames, why even take risks? 2 years, 3 years, why even need equity? Just stick with debt. Just stick with your FDs.
Cash, right?
Or keep cash. So that's about it. Longer, when you think long, think equities and don't try to have a big thumb rule. 50% can be a cutoff. It's the minimum equity you can have over a 5-year period, and then try to up it. Again, these are simply backed by numbers. I'm not trying to just cook up one, but they can change over time, right? In the worst of markets, if I'm going to do a back testing, I will see that you need at least 60% in debt for you to protect your portfolio, right?
That's like an overfitting thing.
Yeah. But as long as it's a 10-year, 15-year time frame, it's okay. If you are going through those low phases, the portfolio will bounce back. It will readjust. It will normalize. I mean, reverting to mean, as if you want to use the technical term. So don't worry too much about what exactly is the proportion. Simply know that equity is not a less than 5-year product. Ideally a 7-year product if numbers were to give you clues. And anything below that needs to be cushioned with debt. Higher debt for shorter time frames, say 2 years, 3 years and so on. The rest depending on how experienced you are in the equity market. 5 years, 6 years of experience, you will be able to handle a lot better than in your first or second year.
So this is interesting, right? I think you made it very personal and made it very simple. So I think the answer to this is someone should actually pause right now, take out a pen and paper, write down his goals and say, okay, how much time do I have for each goal? So let me say this again. So it's sort of like a summary. So 7 years, you're saying statistically, the chances of earning from equity statistically is high, right? It will not be zero. It will not be zero. It could be 1% or more. Which technically means statistically, the recent top we saw 7 years from that date, it's likely that even if people invested at the top, they're likely to not lose money at a 7-year. So that's very interesting. So if I have, say, a 30-year-old who has savings, who's top of his game, earning well, he can give 7 years easily. So he says, okay, I want to buy a house or a car or whatever. He can put 7 years into that. Equity is the name. But if you look at someone 65, he just retired, can he really put in those 7 years? Probably not. So therefore he says, okay, I'll put most of it into debt. So that's one way to do it, right, Vidya?
Right.
The other way, I wanted to ask you this, when we have multiple goals, we can set a time limit for each of those goals. And based on that, we can decide the SIP and decide how much equity, how much debt for each of those goal-based portfolios.
Absolutely. That's where, again, goal-based portfolio comes in. Like I said earlier, choosing your asset allocation and instruments vary for each goal, right? So if you have a goal 2 years down the line, you are obviously not going to have high equities in it. Yeah. If you have another retirement goal 30 years, you can afford to have higher equities. So that makes your job very simple. So again, the mental accounting comes in. Just split everything into goals, split everything into a value, into a time frame, and then automatically how much asset allocation to give for each of this becomes quite clear. And similarly, even it's not even about age. It can be about age, but it need not necessarily be about age. For example, somebody at 60 is a very comfortable pensioner. He's getting enough income from pension or from, say, rental income and so on. He has a lot of corpus to spare. He might want to keep some for emergency, but he might want to grow it, maybe for, just giving it away for his kids or whoever. So
that makes sense.
Those cases too. So essentially it boils down to whether you need income out of this, whether you need this money immediately, and whether you'll be okay just allowing the money to kind of go through dips rather than just the age, right?
Yeah, perfect.
So those are some of the factors.
Yeah, I think they call it in Latin what? Noti sutum, right? Know yourself, right? Know thyself is
exactly. So a lot begins from you.
Yeah, people don't know what they want, right? So how will you go and achieve it? So I think that's one big takeaway from here. Perfect. So let's move on to picking funds. I'm assuming people know what to expect. They know asset allocation. They probably written their goals down by now. So before we get into funds, right, and picking funds, let's talk about active versus passive. So what is active and passive? Can you give the listeners an idea what these two things are? I know you guys have written a lot of cool things around this, so we'll add it in the notes below so people can actually visit and read it. But tell us, what's active versus passive investing?
Okay. So with like passive is a simple, straightforward one. So let me just so you're going to just put your money somewhere and close it and allow it to kind of grow in whatever form it's supposed to grow. You have no control. Just assume that you have no control over it except to save regularly, right? That's what you do by putting your money in an index. An index is something that exchanges with the index builders have already created for you. It's a basket of stocks. The basket of stocks, many of the indices, not all of them, are largely driven by momentum. In other words, when stocks do well, those stocks account for a larger proportion of the index, and when they don't do well, they account for a smaller proportion. So when these indices are already built, set, run in an automated way, all you do is mimic it, right? So you don't do anything specific in terms of trying to remove a stock from something or add a stock or add a new fund instead of an old fund and so on. You simply put your money and allow it to grow with the market. So when I say with the market, your returns are as good as the market, the index that you chose to follow. For example, you chose to follow the Nifty 50, then your returns at all times, your fund, at least your passive fund, is expected to mimic it. So passive essentially means you are not participating in any way in the investment process, right? You are participating to the extent of saving. You are saving, you are looking for, nothing changes in terms of goals, nothing changes in terms of asset allocation. It's just that you are not taking active decisions on whether to remove a fund, whether to add a fund or remove a stock or add a stock. So that's going passive. Active management is all about one. So there are two things. One, an active fund manager is managing an active fund for you, right? So he is sitting on top of it, picking stocks, removing stocks, following strategies, value or growth, and so on. And then on top of it, a second line is that you are sitting in judgment over whether this fund manager is doing the right job. Is he doing a good job? Should I choose A fund or B fund or C fund, right? So this is what essentially, there's a two level of activity there. One is fund manager doing the job and you assessing whether the fund manager is doing a good job and picking a fund accordingly. So the quick thing on, how active and passive are either good for you or not good for you. In the Indian context, in the US context, for instance, passive is a great strategy simply because indices deliver well. Indices are always doing well. Active fund managers find it hard to beat, indices. So it's an easy thing. So you just go buy an index, you sit with it. In India, it's not necessarily the case. Active fund managers have been able to deliver returns over and above index, and that's why the very concept of running active funds, paying for the fund manager, paying for somebody who helps you do that and all that arises. But there are some categories where you find it hard. A fund is not consistently beating the benchmark. You don't know whether a fund will slip by the wayside. It may have been performing for 5-6 years and suddenly you see a dip in its performance. And then you don't know whether to hold the fund or whether you should move to another fund. It's a most often asked question to us. My fund is not doing well now. Should I exit it or should I hold on? That's a question that many of you ask us. So that comes from the fact that you don't know why suddenly a fund is not performing, whether the fund manager's strategy was wrong or whether something happened in the market and so on. Now, this is one limitation. So while active funds seek to deliver you higher returns if you're with the right funds, maintaining them is difficult, and that's where passive makes it a lot easy. With passive, you can't be greedy though. You can only have returns as much as the market. So don't expect your index fund to beat the market. It's not going to happen. So you simply expect your index fund to deliver as much as the market and be happy with it. And if you want more, you should test that out with active funds. The only thing being with active funds, you ought to be active. You ought to be active in terms of understanding what your funds do, in terms of weeding out underperformers occasionally and making sure your portfolio is up to date with quality funds.
Interesting. So you explained active and passive very quickly. Active is where you're investing in a manager's insight or the company's insight and they're managing the fund for you. And then you have passive, which may be following an index like the Nifty or the Sensex or whatever that index fund is actually following, an indice where there's no calculation, it's just replicating the entire index and is growing from there. Now the $100 million question with you is whether I choose active or passive. I'll have to go through some fund, right? So how do I avoid dud funds? Let's put it that way. How do I know, okay, this may be a bad fund? How do I know that?
Right. So it's not like you said, it's $1 million question, and it needs some practice for investors to pick. Like Pratik rightly you pointed out that most people go behind performance, right? So when a fund is performing well, you just pick the fund. So when equity is doing well, you pick equity, and within equity, if a fund is delivering the highest, you pick the A fund. Now the problem with picking these funds is, we should remember, for example, let's take the case of stocks, right? Supposing TCS as a stock, I'm just giving an illustrative example here, has delivered 40% returns, in just a few months' time. And you pick the stock, what happens? You are basically picking a stock that is highly valued. It has surged, its valuation is high, and you don't know whether it's going to give a repeat performance all the time, right? Now, this is a risk to some extent in a portfolio too. A fund manager has built a portfolio of stocks which has delivered super high returns. Now, when they have delivered these kind of returns, the fund manager has to ensure that he is rejigging his portfolio to ensure he has found the next set of stocks that equally deliver well, right? So there's no such thing as a high valuation mutual fund, because you can always churn the stocks in a mutual fund to ensure that you're with quality stocks that deliver. But the risk is you are expecting a repeat performance from a fund manager who has had a quality set of stocks that have delivered. He has to now ensure that it continues to deliver at this rate. Now that's where the challenge comes. And that's where trying to pick funds simply based on this near-term performance is a big risk, because you're entirely depending on the fund manager to repeat the feat that he did in recent past, right? That's where you can go wrong. So picking funds is all about essentially looking for those that can consistently perform over several periods, right? So if your fund, for example, has been able to beat the index in 2006 and 7 and then fell less in 2008, maybe it didn't beat the index that well in 2009, but that's okay. In 2010, it managed a little better. In 2011, it probably contained falls 2011 and 12, or, the volatility better. And then in 2013, it delivered. So when you look at this kind of year-on-year performance, and you see that a fund in the category of funds that you have largely has remained in the top quartile, in the sense it's among the, top 25% in the category, and it may not be in the top, but it has delivered consistently. That's a big plus for a fund, provided you already know what category of fund you want. I'll come to that a little later. So picking a fund essentially simply involves looking at consistency. Why are we so insistent on consistency? Because people ask us, you are simply looking at past performance and saying, what's the point? Because past performance, so you have the, disclaimer on past performance. So how does it matter? The fact is, it gives you, just as history often, gives you a good idea of what to expect in future or how to handle things in future, which is why history is very important, right? So is it with mutual funds. When mutual funds go through ups and downs in the market, it is a testament to how they are able to manage those markets, how they are able to deliver in those markets. And that's why looking at that and seeing if they are consistent in what they do, rather than flash of the pan performance in 1 year and then a deep fall, then next year, looking at consistency helps us know, okay, this fund will manage a big bear market and it will deliver reasonably in a bull market. 1. 2, the more important thing, at least in the Indian context, is many funds that fall sharply in bear markets find it very hard to recover, because Indian markets are, can be very ruthless. Some set of stocks that, have been really beaten down never come back in the next cycle, right? It's a new set of stocks that come back. Right. So if a fund manager was very unfortunate to hold that kind of a portfolio, he may take a long while to, rejig his portfolio to come back to shape and then deliver, right? And by the time your market, your funds, your returns have run up. So these kind of volatility in performance essentially doesn't help in terms of building your wealth, because once it falls, there's a huge opportunity loss. For example, in 2000, let's take 2008-9, funds, which were ready and with a quality portfolio, maybe zoomed like 120% in 2009, delivering just 120% returns, whereas the others would hardly have managed to catch up with 70% or 60%, because one, they would have had the old time favorites, the favorites of 2006-7, which completely went out of market favor, and a new set of stocks came in. So I'm digressing a bit, but the reason why I keep saying this is that looking at performance, near-term performance, therefore won't help. This consistency, how a fund has performed time and again in terms of being somewhere out there, not necessarily in the top. This is one very major factor that you look at while picking a fund. The second thing, cost is very important, expense ratio is very important, but I would say with equity funds, don't be obsessed with expense ratio for the simple reason, these are not like debt delivering 6% or 5% and so on over the long term, right? So if there is, and your returns is always post your expense ratio. So you know that after the cost, this is what my fund has delivered, right? So if the fund has still delivered 5 percentage points over your index, then you shouldn't have much cause for worry. So it basically means the active fund manager is paid a lot, but he's doing a good job, right? So which is fine for you. So this is what essentially you'll do if you hired a manager yourself, right? So that's what you end up doing. So costs are important, but not too important. The third thing, and this is where, it gets tricky, is the strategy or the style of the fund and whether it fits your portfolio, right? So mixing strategies and mixing styles in your portfolio becomes very necessary. Again, it depends on your own time frame and risk appetite. As an investor, as a new investor, if you're just come into equities, you do not know the kind of volatility that equities can give you. Then picking top funds in the mid-cap space and putting it to 70-80% of your portfolio can be really harmful, right? So what do mid-caps do? Mid-caps help you give those additional bit of returns. So they just need to be there kind of to prop growth, but they can't be your core, right? So you add some amount of mid-caps. You keep your core with your large cap or multi-cap and so on. So the category and style of investing here becomes very important. Again, there, value investing, growth style investing, right? These are various things that fund manager tell you, growth at reasonable price, right, things like that. It's hard for you to figure what exactly the strategy is. Suffice to know that generally, in the Indian context, most funds do a little bit of everything because they want to deliver, right? A very few, like pure value, take a value focus and then they may not deliver for a long while. Value as a strategy can take years of underperformance before it delivers, because sometimes they may be trapped in value itself. So that happens. So when you pick styles, you need to mix. Same thing that I said, the sunglasses and the umbrella thing applies here. You don't know when value is going to perform. You don't know when growth is going to perform.
Neither does the manager. Yeah.
Nor does the manager. Definitely not. So you can't count on the manager. I'll come to that in a bit on the fund management part. You can't count on the fund manager. Instead, you can count on your portfolio covering that up for you with proper diversification, right? So a bit of mid-cap, large cap, multi-cap, how much to have again boils down to your risk appetite. Somebody with slightly higher risk, longer time frame can afford a little bit more of mid-caps, rather than somebody who's conservative or maybe has just a 5-year time frame, then you can't take too much of mid-caps. Why am I saying this? Because when mid-caps fall, they can fall really hard. And again, it takes time to bounce back, right? So these kind of small adjustments to your portfolio, some mid-cap, some large cap, some multi-cap, and within that, a mix of strategies, right? So this is where, you need your studying, your understanding a fund. So it's not just what's given in the style box. Most of the style box in funds will have growth and value mix. They'll be right at the center.
Yeah.
So it's hard. It's hard to really understand. Very few will actually explain to you that this fund has this kind of a tilt. Let's take contra funds, for example. Many contra funds will have about 30% portfolio in growth stocks, right? They will hardly be cheap stocks. They will be expensive stocks, but they do that to kind of counter the risk with value, right? So these are things that you need to learn over time. These are things, of course, people like us try. That's essentially what we do. That's the only thing we do actually, where we understand portfolios better. So we know whether they're going to deliver. We know how to mix them. End of the day, it's all about mixing styles and mixing strategies. Now that becomes important. So I said consistency, I said expense ratio is important, but not too important. Then I said mixing the right styles and strategies become important. The fourth, I would say, don't go simply by fund managers. Most people will swear by fund managers. I don't have to name the heroes in the Indian fund management space. Most know, but they're all great people. I have learned a lot, have great respect for them, but you have to depend on the process. It's a musical chair. People keep moving across fund houses. So you're not going to simply be selling your fund and moving to where that fund manager goes. You will be churning your portfolio. You'll be incurring taxes, loans. All this is unnecessary. So understanding the process is very important. Funds that have process, it just shows up in the way their portfolio moves, right? For example, a fund, I'll just give a illustrative example like quantum long-term value. This fund we all know will not hesitate to move into cash at the least alarming sign of market going bubble. It paid a price for doing that, but that's its strategy, right? So you understand. When a fund underperforms because that's what it's stated as its strategy, that's fine, because you at least know what to expect from the fund. This fund in this kind of market is not going to go overweight on equity. It's going to stay with cash, right? And then there may be funds. Some fund houses are always with equity come what may. Their equity position will never go below 96% or so. So you know what to expect from them. Now this is process. This is clear-cut strategy, and this is what you need to look for with funds, right? Because once you know, for example, a fund that has stated itself value, you won't be shocked to see it underperforming in a big bull market, right? Because you expected that, right? So it gives you more certainty. Understanding the process, understanding the strategy gives more certainty rather than just trusting on what the fund manager says. A fund manager can say, trust me, I've kept this stock for a reason. That's fine. But what's the process and what do you do when something underperforms? A stock underperforms for very long. Will the fund manager reduce the exposure and move so that he cuts, there's no more opportunity loss. So these are the kind of things that you observe. This requires a lot of portfolio understanding. This comes with time. And you're regularly going through your fund portfolios. And therefore, the fifth thing and the more important thing is keeping your portfolio compact. When it comes to just picking funds, it's not just about, picking, looking at the Sharpe and looking at your standard deviation and looking at consistency. It's also, you can't have 20 funds. Invariably, if you have 20 funds, there will be duplication. And one super performing growth fund will probably be pulled down by a very poor performing growth fund. And therefore, your portfolio, return might just turn out to be nil. So you need to be careful about, not diversifying too much. This is also a very crucial thing about picking funds, because you pick a fund and then you look at another fund, you like it, you think it is different from A, and therefore you add it. So when you do that, you need to understand, are you adding value to your portfolio by, for example, if you pick a US-based fund, right? And you don't have one, it makes sense to do that. It makes sense to do that simply because, you are diversifying your risk. You are going for a market which is not necessarily highly correlated with us. So when your market is underperforming, the chances are that that market helps you stay afloat, right? So these kind of factors also need to go. So it's not just the numbers. The numbers, yes, we can talk about it in detail. Another time we're doing a kind of presentation. There are a lot of quantitative metrics, but quantitative metrics only give you 20-30% of what you need to know about a fund. The rest comes from the fund's portfolio, the style, the strategy, the process, and how you mix all of them, right? So that's by and large, what you need to look at.
No, I think this is a lot of food for thought, right? For people who are, at least for the first time, trying to pick a fund. One, you said relative performance. How is the fund actually performing when Nifty is going up or when a benchmark is going down? And especially when it goes down, how did it fare? Because there's something called negative compounding. If, the portfolio, God forbid, fell 50%, it needs 100% to come back. All those things matter. So you have that. You also spoke about the equity, the expense ratio cost and equity doesn't matter that much because equity is such an asset class that tends to compound over a long period of time, and the returns you see are after expense ratio. So don't fret too much. You also talked about try to mix styles a little bit. have value, have momentum, at least understand these styles. You also said mix up mid and large, and don't go by the fund manager, right? What you really want is the process. Like when we invest or we think HDFC Bank is a good company, or TCS is a good company, or Infosys is a good company, not to invest, but as a company, you like their processes and not necessarily only their CEO, right? The CEO is one thing in the entire thing. So I guess that's what Vidya was trying to teach us, that fund managers aren't the only thing that should be driving that portfolio. And finally, don't over diversify and diversify your portfolios by having 20 funds. You need to keep it compact. Excellent.